All right, so I'm actually almost finished with this chapter of Hugh Capet, and then onward to his son Robert, the next king in line. I'm going to leave you with Rosala here, who is the wife of Robert, and I just thought it was funny. Okay, now we're still talking about the peerage. The institution of the peerage has likewise been ascribed to him, but this is an error and it has no foundation whatever in history. The term peer, other known as pair, is as old as the monarchy, and it is derived from the Latin word par, which means equal. In this sense only was it used under the first and second race. The royal sons of Louis the Gentle called themselves peer. In the famous treaty of partition concluded at Verdun. In the time of Charlemagne, Chrodegand applied the appellation to the bishops and abbots, and a century before that had been given to monks by Dagobert. Louis the Gentle, in one of his ordinances, forbids the soldiers to force their peers to drink. Ut in host nemo parem sum bibere cogat. It will be seen hereafter that, when the cities had acquired the right of municipal jurisdiction by what were called charters of community, they conferred on their judges the name of citizen peers. Père bourgeois. But insensibly this title became confined to gentlemen who possessed heredity and patrimonial fiefs. Peers, like the peerage class and la. Okay, so peers then, properly so called, were the vassals who held under the same lord, not because they were equal to their feudal lord, but because they were peers among themselves, holding their fiefs under the same person, in the same manner and by the same obligation of paying faith and homage, of serving their lord in the wars, and of attending him in all great ceremonies, and finally of assisting him to hold his court of justice. For the peers were judges throughout the extent of that lordship of which their peerage was holden, but the law did not permit them to sit as judges when they were parties concerned. This prohibition was endeavoured to extend to the king himself, but they could not prevail, as it was deemed that in defending his own rights he defended those of the crown. From these circumstances we may infer that there were as many peerages in the kingdom as there were fiefs immediately holden of one certain lordship. But all peers were not holden in equal consideration. Those of the king who paid an immediate homage to the crown were regarded as men of superior dignity to those of the Count of Champagne, who were only sub-vassals. These were excluded from the national parliament and from a seat among the nobles of the realm, while the former, being judges in all matters of state, composed what was called the Court of France, the King's Court, or the Court of Peers. The number was nearly fixed, nor yet confined to the dukes and counts. All barons who held immediately of the king were equally peers. They were peers of France because of the immediate dependence always constituted the essence of the peerage. In the history of Saint Louis, we read that the prince having adopted a regulation with regard to the Jews, it was ratified and approved by the barons and peers, who subscribed it indiscriminately, which seems to prove that the presidency of the 12 peers was not thoroughly established at the commencement of that monarch's reign. It was not till about the 14th century that the feudal dignity of barons began to consider as inferior to that of duke or count. The appellation of peer was not originally a title of dignity, for which reason it is that we find no ancient deed in which the dukes and counts assume it. They did not take that title till the number of peers were reduced to 12, though at what period the reduction took place has been subject of much controversy, and has never been precisely ascertained. Some pretend that this institution was established so far back as the reign of Charlemagne, but their supposition has no other foundation than the apocryphal tales of Archbishop Turpin. Others ascribe it to Hugh Capet, but these can produce no authority for their opinion. Savine imputes it to King Robert, who he tells us formed a secret council composed of 6 of their principal nobles and 6 ecclesiastics, whom he honoured with the title of peers. He doubtless did not recollect that the commencement of the 3rd race, the cities of Laon, Langres, Beauvais, Noyon, and Chalon-upon-Marne, did not belong to their bishops. The county of Langres was not united to the bishopric till the reign of Louis VII. Du Tillet is of opinion that this reform in the peerage was effected by Louis the Young at the coronation of his son Philip Augustus. The king, says he, in order to prevent confusion at the splendid ceremony, selected from among the vast number of prelates and nobles who attended as immediate vassals of the crown, the 12 who have ever since been distinguished for this illustrious function. The distinction, however, by no means detracted from the dignity of the ancient baronies of the kingdom. These have ever continued to be real peerages of France, though their possessors no longer enjoy the same privileges as before the reduction took place. The 12 peers, on the contrary, have always possessed, in virtue of their peerage, a seat in the parliaments, in the council chamber, in the beds of justice, and in the great ceremonies. France, from its dismembered state, was involved during the reign of Hugh Capet in poverty and barbarism. While Greece and Italy were famous for their beautiful manufactures, the French were unable to imitate them, since their cities were unprivileged and their country disunited. internal commerce was scarcely known, and the inhabitants of one province were frequently strangers to the distance and situation of the next. Such was the ignorance which prevailed, that few people could read, and still fewer write. There were no title deeds of estates, and no deeds or regifters of marriages. Hence, the danger of contracting an alliance within the prohibited degrees was great, and this circumstance gave rise to numerous divorces and scandalous separations. So again, they mention not reading and writing, and reminding that no deeds or registers of marriage even really existed, no title deeds to property. So very difficult, which is unusual, isn't it? One would think they would grab at that. Anyway, 996, Robert, on the death of his father, had just entered his 27th year, and his subjects were already accustomed to see him hold the reins of government. They acknowledged him for their sovereign without opposition or murmur. But though the commencement of his reign was, by this means, exempt from domestic commotion, his happiness was interrupted by the intrigues of the sovereign pontiff. The court of Rome was highly displeased at the treatment of Archbishop Arnoul, who, though restored to his see by a decree of the council, was still regarded as a state prisoner. As a mark of his displeasure, the Pope evinced a disposition to annul the marriage of Robert with Bertha, widow of Eudes, Count of Chartres and Blois, and daughter of Conrad, King of Burgundy. His pretext was that Robert had stood godfather to a child of that princess, and that he was her cousin in the 4th degree. Two impediments to a legal marriage, which a dispensation alone could remove. 997. Robert, who was extremely fond of his wife, took every means to prevent a separation, in which his love and his honour were equally interested. He thought, by restoring Arnoul, a confirmation of that union in which his happiness was centred might be more easily obtained from the Pope. But this had no effect on Gregory V, who was the creature of the Emperor Otho III, to whom he was related, and was wholly swayed by that monarch and by Gerbert, who were both enemies to the reigning family. This pontiff had been expelled from his church by Crescian, consul of Rome, who caused John XVI, a Greek monk named Philogath, to be elected in his place. But Gregory was no sooner restored to his dignity than, after ordering the eyes of his competitor to be put out, and his nose and tongue to be cut off, he assembled a council in which he annulled the marriage of the French monarch. Robert, enraged at his insolence, refused to submit to a sentence which he justly regarded as an attack upon his majesty of the throne. Gregory, however, persisted, and by an infamous abuse of power excommunicated the king, and laid the kingdom under an interdict, by which means the celebration of divine service was stopped throughout the realm, the administration of the sacrament suspended, and the burial of the dead in consecrated grounds forbidden. This was the first instance of a similar sentence being enforced in France, and the nation was so alarmed and so blinded by a degrading spirit of superstition that the monarch was abandoned by his courtiers and even his domestics. So nobody really liked parting with God, especially in the grave. The murmurs of the people, the defection of the nobles, and the well-founded dread of a general revolt at length compelled the king to submit, and to dismiss his wife, who still preserved, notwithstanding, the title of queen. After their separation, Robert, being desirous of heirs, married Constance, daughter of William I, Count of Provence, and a woman of extraordinary beauty, but whose personal charms concealed a mind polluted by pride, vanity, and caprice. Brought up in a country where the warmth of the climate, by affording a powerful stimulus to the impulses of nature, strongly invited to voluptuous enjoyments. Her retinue was composed of dancers, dancers and scarce players, and youthful libertines of rank. It must have been an instrument. And youthful libertines of rank, who sensibly introduced luxury and debauchery into a court, which had hitherto been distinguished for its gravity, simplicity, and modesty. The arrival of this princess may also be considered as the epoch in which a taste for poetry first prevailed in France, a taste that was afterwards improved by the troubadours, and which has since attained to as great a degree of excellence as the language will admit. The splendor of her charms and the ascendancy which they gave her over her husband rendered the new queen so arrogant that in time she became insupportable to the whole nation, even to her own children. Now, I don't believe it's Rosella. That's another one. This, for some reason, she's showing up. I've got Rosella in the 15th century. I'm going to have to change this really quickly because I think they have the wrong... Yeah, I think they have the wrong one. So don't look at that. Rosella's in the 15th century there, and we're not anywhere near. Not at all. We're coming out of the 9th century, getting into the 10th. That's about it. So where are we? Hugh de Beauvais, Count Palatine and Prime Minister, enjoyed the confidence of his master. I did want to see a picture of this other one though, so let's go ahead and find this one who's really changing. She's changing the scene. Now apparently, according to Wiki, they do have Rosella here, and they have Bertha of Burgundy, and they have Constance, and Constance is the one who is bringing in poetry and luxury and non-moderation. But there is a mention of Bertha here, so yes, and I was still looking for Rosella there. I did not see Rosella. I only see Bertha. Maybe Rosella's going to be listed, I don't know, some other time. Oh, it was annulled, so it wasn't a real marriage, they are saying. But she's not listed in the book thus far. So, boo-hoo. If she's not listed in the book, maybe she wasn't really a wife or one to be annulled. It is looking at 996. So it's a bit of a problem there. We just have... No. I take it back. He evinced a disposition to annul the marriage of they're calling her the marriage of Robert with Bertha. So they're annulling the marriage of Robert with Bertha, but not with Rosella of Italy. So I'm sorry, I can't find Rosella here. I'll seek her out another time. I'm continuing with Constance of Arles. I was going to try and get an image of her, but it's too late. I can't right now. There she is. Okay, the splendor of her charms and ascendancy. Okay, she's done all of these things. She's arrogant. And in Hugh de Beauvais, Count of Palatine, all of that, he experienced from the impropriety of his wife's conduct. Okay, so they're having a problem with her conduct. This was sufficient to make that nobleman an object of her hatred and revenge. She accordingly had him assassinated in the presence of her husband, who in vain endeavoured to save the life of his favourite. The internal tranquillity which the kingdom had enjoyed for some time was interrupted by Eudes II, Count of Champagne, a son of Bertha, and by her first husband. This politic and ambitious prince, being desirous to open a communication between the county of Chartres and La Brie by securing a passage over the Seine, cast his eyes on Melun, which Hugh Capet had given to Count Bouchard. That nobleman kept but a small garrison in the place, under the command of a viscount named Gautier, who had a pretty and intriguing wife. Eudes feigned a violent passion for this lady, and being a handsome young man, his suit was successful. By her means, he bribed the husband to deliver the town into his hands. I'll give you a town. Count Bouchard complained to Robert, who undertook his defence, and being joined by the forces of Richard II, Duke of Normandy, Melun was invested and in a few days reduced. Eudes found means to escape, but Gautier and his wife were taken and hung on a lofty mountain in sight of the town. Gentlemen formerly were not capitally punished for rebellion or felony. Treason alone could incur the penalty of death. In 1000 AD to 1006, this war was succeeded by another of greater importance and longer duration. Henry, Duke of Burgundy, uncle to the king and brother to Hugh Capet, had married Gerbage. That's really her name. Gerbage, it's terrible, isn't it? Countess of Dijon. You could say Gerbage. a Countess of Dijon, widow to Aldebert, King of Italy. He died some years after his marriage and left but one natural child, named Eudes, to whom he assigned the county of Béarn. Robert was the lawful heir to the duchy, but the duke, previous to his death, had adopted for his heir Otho William, and son of his wife by her first marriage, who was already Count of Burgundy. That nobleman, supported by Landry, Count of Nevers, Bruno, Bishop of Langres, and Eudes, Count of Champagne, took possession of the disputed territory, while Robert, determined to enforce his pretensions, had recourse to arms, and his forces were strengthened by the troops of his kinsman, the Duke of Normandy. Though repulsed in his first attempt on Auxerre, that town afterwards capitulated. Its example was followed by Sens, and the walls of Avalon are reported to have fallen before the victor. Yet even the most credulous must allow that the cruelty of the monarch ill-deserved the interposition of divine providence. The favour of heaven was ill repaid by the inhumanity of the king, and the wretched inhabitants were doomed to expiate their resistance by exile and death. More than 5 years were consumed in the gradual reduction of Burgundy. Otho William was at length compelled to abandon his vain hopes and to relinquish whatever places he had occupied. Eudes acquiesced in the peaceable enjoyment of the countryside county of Beauvais, and Robert, to gratify the Burgundians, who were desirous of an independent prince, and to soothe his own vassals, who were jealous of their power in the aggrandissement of the crown, bestowed the Duchy of Burgundy on his second son, Henry, also called Henri, with the title of Duke. In 1006 to 1020. But few events of importance occurred during the long space of 14 years. After an expedition into Flanders, where the king promoted an accommodation between the Emperor of Germany and the heiress of Charles of Lorraine, with respect to the territories of that prince, he resolved, with the advice of his ministers, to associate to the throne his eldest son Hugh, who, though but in his 18th year, had deservedly acquired the appellation of Great. The ceremony of his coronation was performed at Compiègne in the year 1007. About the same time, a sect of heretics appeared in France that soon demanded the attention of government. They held in derision all the mysteries of religion, despised the sacraments, condemned marriage, treated the accounts of the creation of the world contained in the Old Testament as so many dreams, and neither believed that virtue would meet with any future reward, nor the most criminal pleasures incur punishment. They used to assemble in private houses during the night, where they recited a kind of litany in honor of evil spirits, and did not cease their invocations till they saw a demon appear amongst them, when they immediately put out the lights. Each man, taking the first woman he could lay hands on, proceeded to the enjoyment of those pleasures for which they deemed any lawful permission unnecessary. For repressing this licentiousness, the king convened a council at Orleans, and the leaders of this voluptuous sect being arrested, they were taken before the bishops, who desired to be informed of their religious tenets, but they studiously avoided any direct answers to the questions proposed to them, till Arestate, a Norman gentleman who had revealed the whole secret, reproached them with their cowardice and explained the impiety of their system. They then declared that such was their firm belief. In vain did the prelates advert to the doctrines of Christianity. In vain did they talk of the Immaculate Conception, of the birth and death of our Saviour. The only answer they could obtain from these obstinate heretics was, "We were not present. We cannot believe that to be true." The council, finding them incorrigible, condemned them all to be burnt alive. As they proceeded to the place of execution, they betrayed evident symptoms of gaiety and pleasure. But when they felt the effects of the flames, their enthusiasm and their courage forsook them, and they exclaimed that they had been deceived. The king and queen attended this cruel exhibition, during which the latter thrust out the eye of her confessor, who was one of the heretics, and with her cane. 2 years after this execution, another set of these heretics appeared at Arras, but the Bishop Gerard, a man whose fervent piety was regulated by reason and tempered by charity, instead of having recourse to threats, convinced them of their error by argument and persuasion, and brought them to a public abjuration. So true it is that the throne of truth is not erected on a scaffold, and that mildness will lead where severity disgusts. The king, finding tranquillity established throughout the realm, resolved on a journey to Rome, in order to visit the tombs of the apostles. He was accompanied by several of the prelates, and every place he passed through experienced the effects of his munificence. On his return, he dedicated the church to Saint Agnan, at Orleans, which he had recently built, and to which he afterwards bequeathed the treasures of his own chapel, and among a variety of other curious articles, an enormous bell, which he had ordered to be solemnly baptized by the name of Robert. AD 1022 to 1031. In the following year, an interview took place between Robert and the emperor on the banks of the Meuse, for the purpose of settling some trifling matters of dispute, which, if neglected, might have led to a serious rupture. The magnificence displayed on this occasion is spoken of in terms of rapture by the ancient writers, but the conclusion of an amicable treaty between the royal visitors afforded a better theme for national congratulation. This excursion was succeeded by a circumference that threatened the kingdom with all the calamities of a civil war. Wasn't circumference, yeah, circumstance, a circumstance that threatened the kingdom with all the calamities of a civil war. Hugh secretly withdrew from court, and being joined by several of the young nobility, this is Hugh, erected the standard of revolt. His motive for this retreat was the pride and severity of his mother, who obstinately refused to establish his household or to let him have any share in that government to which he had been formerly associated. Fortunately, the insurrection was speedily quelled, and Hugh, returning to his duty, was pardoned by his father and admitted to a participation of his throne and authority. The prince never after transgressed the rules of propriety, but observed the most perfect submission to the will of his parent and his sovereign, if the authors of these times may be credited, and there is no reason for impeaching their veracity. He was a father to the poor, a protector of the church, an advocate for the people, and the friend of virtue. The possession of these numerous perfections rendered his name so celebrated throughout Europe that Italy, at the death of Henri II, invited him to wear the imperial crown. But in a short time after this flattering offer was made, Hugh the Great sorrow of all of France, was taken off in the flower of his youth. He was interred in the church of Saint Corneille at Compiègne. So they were really getting into it. Everybody loved this. But Hugh, to the great sorrow of France, was taken off in the flower of his youth. So it looks like Hugh didn't make it. Okay. On the death of Hugh, it was natural that Robert should associate his next son, Henri, to the dignity with which he had imparted to his deceased brother. But the justice of this nomination was opposed with indecent warmth and determined obstinacy by Constance, and her partiality for her younger son, Robert, agitated the court with all the fury of contending factions. Yet neither the secret arts of intrigue nor the open violence of the offended queen could subdue the inflexible integrity of her husband. In an assembly at Rheims, Henri received the crown from the impartial justice of his father, and Robert, his younger brother, refusing to join in the daring measures of Constance, became equally the subject of her hatred and persecution. The two princes, harassed by the incessant enmity of their implacable mother, retired from court and entered into an alliance for their mutual defence. The eldest possessed himself of the castle of Dreux, and the youngest seized as Avallon in the Duchy of Burgundy. The unnatural passions of a female had already enkindled the torch of civil commotion, and the gloomy flame was beheld with horror throughout the kingdom of France. But an explanation ensuing between the king and his children, the princes returned to their duty, were again restored to the confidence of their father, and the force with which they had been assembled to extinguish the dissensions of his family was happily employed by Robert in humbling the haughty nobles of Burgundy, who had presumed to withhold the homage due to the sovereign. Yaiza. The remainder of this reign, during which the kingdom enjoyed more years of peace and prosperity than it had known for some centuries, was chiefly employed by Robert in the erection of pious edifices, in reforming the manners of the clergy, and in other works of devotion, private and practical. In the year 1031, this virtuous monarch was seized at Melun with a violent disorder that soon brought him to the grave. He expired in the 61st year of his age and the 45th of his reign. His body was conveyed to Saint-Denis, where it was deposited in the royal vault, without an epitaph or any other sepulchral embellishment. Robert had 3 wives, Ludegarde or Rosal, which I just showed you earlier. Rosal, so now she is being listed. Rosalie, widow to Arnauld, Count of Flanders. Bertha, widow to Eudes, Count of Chartres, and Blois. I have such a problem with that one. Blois. Blois, I can't say it. And Constance, daughter of William, Count of Provence. By the last he had Hugh, who died before his father, and Henri, who succeeded to the throne, Robert, to whom he allotted the Duchy of Burgundy, Eudes, who, according to some writers, was Bishop of Auxerre, Adelaide, wife to Renaud, Count of Nevers, and Adela, first married to Richard III, Duke of Normandy, and afterwards to Baldwin, Count of Flanders. Robert was equally distinguished for his piety, moderation, and prudence. Wisely studious to avert the calamities of war, and anxious to promote the felicity and welfare of his subjects, who were never disturbed by the oppressions of domestic tyranny or the devastations of foreign armies. The rigour with which he punished, in the reduction of Burgundy, the spirited resistance of the inhabitants of Avallon, had cast a a slight shade on a reign of unprecedented clemency. Yet a people whose annals have hitherto displayed almost a constant succession of sanguinary and ferocious princes might well exclaim on the death of Robert, "We have lost a father who governed us in peace, beneath whose authority we dwelt in security, who suffered not in others that oppression which he himself disdained, who commanded our affections, and who banished our fears." In his conduct to the poor, his humanity and his charity were eminently conspicuous. The latter, indeed, almost degenerated into weakness, since by encouraging a spirit of indolence in the lower class of people, it must certainly have tended to mar industry, and to impede those agricultural improvements which an enlightened monarch should ever attend to, and the necessity of which was never more evident than in the reign of Robert. He daily distributed food to 300 poor people, and sometimes 1,000. Every Holy Thursday he served them on his knees, and being clothed in sackcloth, washed their feet. Hence originated the custom that has ever since been observed by the French monarchs of washing the feet of 12 poor people on Holy Thursday, and of waiting on them at table, assisted by all the princes of the blood and the principal nobility. Robert's compassion for the poor would sometimes betray him into acts of injustice, for we are told that when he had no money to give them, he would tell them to go and steal, and be angry if they were prevented from doing so. Helgard the monk says that rogues, under pretense of begging, would frequently follow him into his apartment, and take from him whatever was worth taking, either in his pockets or on his clothes. One of them having cut off the half of a piece of gold fringe, which was about to take away the rest. And he was about to take away the rest, when the king mildly requested him to be contented with what he had, and to leave the rest to satisfy the wants of his companions. The disposition of his queen Constance being very different from his own, he was under the necessity of performing his acts of charity in secret, and his gifts were generally accompanied by this caution: "Be sure you don't let Constance know it." As he was going one day to church, he surprised 2 persons in the act of fornication. The horror, says the Abbé Vallée, which he experienced at the sin, did not extinguish his compassion for the sinner. He threw his cloak over them, and went straight to the altar to pray for their conversion. He then sent one of his attendants to fetch another cloak, forbidding him, under pain of his displeasure, to mention the circumstance to anyone, but more particularly to the queen. Notwithstanding the efforts of this prince to render his subjects happy, he had the misfortunes to see his kingdom a prey to the horrors of famine at several different times. The first was general throughout Europe, but the second was confined to France, where it was attended with circumstances peculiarly horrid. There were people raging with hunger in such a dreadful degree that they dug up the dead bodies to eat. Others seized upon the children in the streets, or waylaid the travellers in the fields and woods. At Tournus, in Burgundy, a butcher exposed human flesh to public sale. But this inhuman traffic was put a stop to, and the brute who carried it on justly condemned to flames. Another man who kept a public bouffe in the forest near Massonne murdered his guests and ate them. Murders his guests and eat them. God, it's horrible. He was detected by 2 passengers, a man and his wife, who were lucky enough to effect their escape, and when his house was searched, 48 human heads of men, women, and children, whose bodies he had devoured, were found. Horrid, horrid, horrid. The barbarous wretch experienced the same punishment as the butcher. Such was the scarcity of food that people were reduced to, the necessity of making bread with a kind of white earth, resembling pipe clay, mixed with a very small portion of flour or bran. This dreadful famine was followed by a pestilence, during which the people were so weak from want of sustenance that they were unable to assist each other. Thus the sick remained without relief, and the dead without burial. It is in vain that we seek the probable cause of these calamities in any of the French historians, either ancient or modern. The former, instead of attempting to account for what must have had a natural cause, recite the superstitions, the superstitious tales of the times, and tell us of showers of blood and other dismal tokens of divine vengeance, by which they were preceded, while the latter repeat these tales, and though they treat them with the derision they merit, yet withhold the information we seek for. Had any violent drought or other extraordinary circumstance occasioned the famine, it could not, we apprehend, have escaped the attention of contemporary writers. We are therefore of opinion it must have been, as the kingdom was evidently infested with crowds of beggars. Oh, they were infested with crowds of beggars, from the numbers which the king himself maintained, and consequently encouraged. Perhaps the early Franks, like the ancient Germans, deemed the cultivations of their lands too ignoble and laborious an employment for them. Yet the monks, we find, set an example of agricultural improvement in the lands belonging to their convents, and the time was peculiarly favourable for such exertions, as the nation enjoyed a perfect state of tranquillity for a long series of years. All right, so unfortunate with Robert. I have a few more to read. Okay. From the custom that prevailed with the first monarchs of the Capetian race, of associating their eldest sons with them in the empire, we must not infer either that the crown was elective by the nobles of the realm, or that it was necessarily entailed on the eldest son of the king. Under the first race, we have seen the crown invariably hereditary in the family of Meroveus, and all his descendants succeed to it without interruption for upwards of 300 years. It is true, indeed, that sometimes the kingdom was divided between all the sons, and at others one reigned alone, to the prejudice of the rest. Sometimes even a prince of a distant branch was preferred to the children of the deceased monarch. But what inference must we draw from these facts? That the crown, always hereditary in the reigning family, was only elective with regard to the different princes of that family. Under the second race, we still find the same custom and the same form of government prevail. Such is the custom of the French nation, says Foulques, Archbishop of Rheims, in a letter to the Emperor Arnul, that the nobles, without any dependents, choose a prince of the royal family to succeed the king when he is dead. Though Robert and Rodolphe acceded to the throne without any previous election, no conclusion is to be drawn from thence, any more from the elevation of Gondebaud on a shield during the first race. The storm was soon dispelled. Louis the Stranger was recalled from England, and all the nobles, says a contemporary writer, elected him to reign over them by the hereditary right which he had to the crown. This is an apparent contradiction of terms, but the difficulty is solved by referring to the double right by which the ancient monarchs of France held their crown, viz., by their royal birth and by the choice of the nation. The circumstances attending the association of Henri I to the regal dignity prove that at the commencement of the third race the monarchy was still governed by the same spirit and the same maxims. They prove that the hereditary right was incontestably established in the family that had been recently placed on the throne. This then was the general law, and invariably custom of the realm, and the invariable custom. Still, an election always took place, but as during the two first races the choice was confined to the children of the king, with regard to the coronation of Henri I, the king, says Glaber, after the death of the Prince Hugh, began to consider himself which of his 3 surviving sons would be most capable of succeeding him in the throne. This could never have been an object of deliberation had the throne devolved by right to the eldest son of the reigning monarch. The bishops, influenced by the queen, who did not like her eldest son, whom the king betrayed by inclination to favor, demanded, says another contemporary writer, that no decision might take place on this important affair, at least during the life of Robert. She flattered herself with the idea that after the king's death her interest would prove superior to that of her eldest son, whom she affected to represent as a weak, effeminate, and cowardly prince. But what became of these her hopes. If the laws of the realm had necessarily influenced the decision of the electors in favour of the eldest of the royal family. Notwithstanding her opposition, Prince Henri's party prevailed, and, continues Glaber, the king's choice, supported by the concurrence of the nobles, at length placed him on the throne of France. So they're going with the king's choice. These remarks solve all the difficulties that present themselves with regard to the hereditary right of the reigning family to the throne of France. On one side, they show that a succession which was always hereditary did not exclude a real right of election, and on the other, that this right of election, though passive with respect to the family, was active with respect to the different members of that family. In other words, the nation had reserved to itself the power of choosing from among the children of the last monarch that prince which should appear to it the most capable of holding the reins of government, without regard to primogeniture. Thus, in associating their eldest son to the throne, the six first monarchs of the Capetian race were not influenced by any views of fixing the crown to their family, but merely by a desire of avoiding those dissensions which were but by too common at elections. By degrees, these associations led to the establishment of the right of agnation, lineal and hereditary, which insensibly annihilated the elective power. In short, the crown appeared to be so well secured in the family of Hugh Capet that Philip Augustus did not think it necessary to crown his son. The right of primogeniture became a fundamental law of the realm, and has been observed for more than 7 centuries, without the smallest interruption, either from the youngest children or from the eldest of the younger branches. Several ecclesiastical councils were holden during the reign of Robert, by that of Seligstad. Priests are ordered not to say more than 3 masses in a day, and all men except crowned heads forbidden to enter the church with their swords. The fathers of Limoges decreed that nobody could receive penance and absolution from the Pope without the leave of his bishop. The Council of Anse was still more strenuous in defence of the liberties of the Gallican Church. It declared a bull of the Pope's by which the monks of Cluny were exempted from the jurisdiction of their ordinary, to be null and abusive. The Archbishop of Vienne, having in consequence of that bull ordained some of the monks of Cluny, without the permission of the bishop of diocese, thought it necessary to make an apology, and to promise that in future he would never deviate from the rules of the national church. But the most remarkable of these ecclesiastical assemblies was that which was convened at Saint-Denis on the subject of tithes, offerings, presentations, and churches. We have already observed that the ecclesiastical property, even tithes and church livings, have passed into the hands of laymen, and who could not sell them without the king's consent, to which was always annexed the condition that curates and bishops, if they chose to become purchasers, should have the first offer. At length the impropriety of these proceedings was universally acknowledged. Hugh Capet and Robert were the first to set the example of restitution, which was speedily followed by the nobility, who hastened to restore those possessions which their ancestors had usurped from the Church. The bishops wished to monopolize the advantages arising from this pious resolution, and exerted their utmost endeavours to exclude the monks from any participation in them. Abbo, abbot of Fleury, resisted these ungenerous efforts, and finding that the clergy assembled at Saint Denis were about to issue a sentence to the prejudice of the monastic state, he excited the monks and the dependents of the abbey to rise up against them, and they accordingly attacked the prelates, who were obliged to decamp without coming to any decision. Seguin, Archbishop of Sens, a venerable old man, highly respected for his virtue, was wounded between the shoulders by a blow from an axe, and with difficulty escaped, all covered with mud. Such scandalous proceedings could scarcely obtain credit, were they not attested by contemporary writers. But what must appear still more monstrous is that a riot of this nature should pass unpunished and unnoticed, even by the Church. All right, well, that's where I'm ending today. Apparently they were fighting in a church. So we found famine. It was really dreadful. 2 of them, apparently. All of this during Robert I's reign. So why they could not grow food, I don't know. They didn't mention. But it does sound like a terribly miserable ordeal. And I'm very glad we're not living in those times.